You're born at night into a camp of maybe 30 people. No clean water, no word for medicine. And before the children standing around you turn 15, about half of them will be gone. But not the way you think. That isn't a short, miserable life. It's a wall at the very start of one. Clear it, and the bones say you had a real shot at seeing 70. We can read both halves of that in the same graveyard. This is 92,000 years ago. You share the planet with at least 3 other kinds of human. Neanderthals in Eurasia, Denisovans in Asia, a small species on an island called Flores. None of them farm, none of them write. And the thing that supposedly made life better, farming, is still 80,000 years away. This is why being born here was the most dangerous thing you'd ever do, and why the thing that actually killed people is almost never what you'd guess. It starts with the most repeated lie about the ancient world, that nobody lived past 30. You've probably heard this number before. Ancient humans only lived to 30. It shows up in documentaries, in textbooks, in casual conversation, like it's settled fact. And technically, the number is real. Life expectancy at birth for hunter-gatherers averages somewhere around 30 to 33 years. That comes from actual demographic data on modern forager groups. The Hadza, the Kung, the Ache. People still living, or recently living, as foragers. Researchers like Gervin and Kaplan compiled the data in 2007, and that average holds up across multiple populations. But here's the thing nobody tells you about that number. It's an average. And it's an average being crushed by one end of the data. For every grandparent sitting by a fire in their 70s, there was a baby who never opened its eyes. The math doesn't care. It splits the difference. And the difference lands on 30. The actual pattern looks nothing like everyone drops dead at 30. The modal adult lifespan, the age most adults actually died at, once they survived childhood, was somewhere between 68 and 78. That's not a guess. That's the most common outcome for people who made it past the childhood filter. Think about that. You could be born into a world with no hospitals, no antibiotics, no written language, and if you cleared the first 15 years, you had a reasonable shot at seeing your grandchildren. So the cliché isn't just wrong, it's exactly backwards. The short life was real, it just wasn't the adults living it. And that raises a much sharper question. If the adults were reaching their 60s and 70s, who, exactly, was doing all the dying? The dying was happening right where you'd least expect modern people to look. At the very beginning, across studied forager populations, roughly 20 to 30% of all babies born didn't survive to age 1. By age 15, the number climbed to somewhere around 40 to 50%. Some archaeological skeletal samples push even higher. That's not a slow bleed across decades. That's a wall. A massive front-loaded wall of death that you either cleared or you didn't. And if you cleared it, the road on the other side ran surprisingly long. Here's what makes this hard to sit with. You're not imagining strangers. You're imagining babies. Specific babies. Babies held by specific mothers in specific camps who were fed and carried and kept warm by people who wanted them to survive. And roughly half the time, it wasn't enough. And this wasn't because their parents were careless or their world was uniquely cruel. They nursed for 2 to 4 years. Birth spacing stretched to 3 or 4 years, largely because of that intensive nursing. Each child was a multi-year investment of calories, attention, and energy. Losing one wasn't a statistic, it was a catastrophe. So what was actually killing them? Not what you'd guess. Not predators, not warfare. At least, not mostly. The killers were quieter than that. Infection, diarrheal illness, exposure. The 1,000 small failures that a body with no immune memory and no medical backup simply couldn't survive. Death back then wasn't a slow fade at the end of life. It was a wall you hit at the very beginning. Clear the wall, and the road ran long. But here's the thing that makes the wall even taller. The very act of being born was trying to kill you before you even got started. Every human birth, every single one, including yours, is a baby's skull trying to fit through a doorway that was built for something else entirely. Your pelvis wasn't designed for birth. It was designed for walking upright. Bipedalism reshaped the human pelvis millions of years ago, narrowing the birth canal into a tight, bony corridor. And then, over hundreds of thousands of years, human brains kept getting bigger. The skull kept growing. The doorway didn't. This is what researchers call the obstetrical dilemma. Though calling it a dilemma is generous, it's more like an engineering conflict that evolution never fully resolved. The baby's head has to rotate, flex, and squeeze through a passage that barely fits. Today, we have a key for that lock. Obstetricians, C-sections, hands that know what to do when the shoulders get stuck. In 90,000 BC, there was no key. Sometimes the door just didn't open. And this isn't ancient speculation. Without C-sections, obstructed labor still affects roughly 1 million mothers per year today, in populations without full medical access. That's a modern number, and it gives you a floor for how dangerous birth was when there were zero surgical options. Now, the exact mechanism, how much is bipedalism, how much is brain size, how much is something else, is genuinely debated. Researchers like Dunsworth have pushed back on the classic pelvis versus brain framing, but what's not debated is the outcome. Human birth is risky. It was risky then. It's risky now. And back then, a complicated delivery didn't end with a surgeon. It ended with a choice no one should have to make. Every mother who delivered you into your lineage did it without a safety net. Smart move? No. There was no move. There was just the doorway, and the hope that it opened. But let's say you made it. You survived birth. You survived infancy. You're 5 years old, walking around, eating what the band eats. Now the big diseases come, right? The plagues? The epidemics? No. And this is the part that breaks everyone's assumption. Here's what most people picture when they think about ancient disease. Filthy caves, sick bodies, epidemics tearing through camps, measles, smallpox, some kind of prehistoric flu ripping across the population. None of that could happen. Not at 92,000 years ago. Not even close. Epidemic diseases, the crowd diseases, the ones that spread fast and burn through populations, need one thing to survive: crowds. Measles needs a continuously replenishing pool of thousands of susceptible hosts to keep transmitting. Smallpox needs density. These pathogens literally cannot sustain transmission chains in a world where the nearest other band of humans is a 2-day walk away, and your entire social universe is maybe 30 people. At 92,000 years ago, there was roughly 1 person per square kilometer. There were no cities, there were no villages, there were no markets, no trade hubs, no gathering places, where thousands of strangers breathed the same air. You can't have a measles outbreak with no crowd. The diseases that terrify modern humans needed cities to live in, and cities were 80,000 years in the future. So were these people disease-free? No. That's the older, rosier model, and it's been revised. They carried endemic parasites, zoonotic infections from undercooked meat, things like fish tapeworm, chronic, low-grade infections that came from the animals they hunted and the water they drank. The disease load was real, and newer research suggests it was heavier than we used to think. But the shape of disease was completely different. No plagues, no epidemics, no pandemics, just the slow, grinding pressure of parasites, wound infections, and things that festered because nobody had the means to treat them. And that quiet, festering category, that was the real killer, the one hiding in plain sight. Imagine this. You're 25 years old. You've survived birth, survived childhood, survived the wall. You're strong. You're lean. By every measure, you're in the prime of your life. And then you step on something sharp. Or you crack a tooth on a piece of grit in your food. Or you break a bone during a hunt. And these weren't gentle hunts. Direct evidence from around 120,000 years ago shows Neanderthals hunting large game with thrusting spears at close range. Bones of prey animals with embedded spear points. These people were getting close to things that could kill them, and the injuries that came with that life were serious. The trauma pattern across both Neanderthals and early modern humans shows high rates of head and neck injury, the kind you'd see in someone who fights large animals at arm's length. Early studies compared Neanderthal injuries to rodeo riders. Later reassessments found that early Homo sapiens were just as battered. This wasn't a Neanderthal problem, it was a human problem. But the injury itself often wasn't what killed you, the infection was. A bad tooth is annoying today. In 90,000 BC, a bad tooth could be the thing that kills you, slowly, through your own jaw. Forager teeth had fewer cavities than yours, dramatically fewer, actually, but they suffered heavy wear, dental calculus, periodontal disease, and abscesses. And an untreated tooth abscess isn't a dental problem, it's a systemic infection waiting to happen. No antibiotics, no drainage, no dentist, just your immune system, and time. A cut that you'd wash and bandage today was a potential death sentence. A broken leg that any ER would set in an hour was a crisis that could end a life. And yet, and this is the part that stops you, they didn't just let the wounded die. At a site called Saint Césaire, a Neanderthal skull shows the mark of a deliberate blow to the head. A serious injury. The kind that should have killed, but the bone healed. Healed, that person survived for months. After the blow, which means someone fed them, someone cleaned the wound, someone kept them alive, when it would have been easier not to. Survival was never a solo act, and the proof is in the bone. So if every cut was a coin flip, every birth was a gauntlet, and every broken tooth could kill you, how did anyone make it to 70? The answer is fire, and food, and each other. By 92,000 years ago, fire wasn't new. Humans had been controlling fire for tens of thousands of years before this moment. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, Middle Stone Age people were using fire to heat-treat stone tools by 164,000 years ago, deliberately altering the rock's structure to make sharper, more reliable blades. At Border Cave, they were cooking starchy rhizomes, unlocking calories that raw plants couldn't deliver. Fire did three things that kept you alive. It kept you warm, in a world that was cooling. Remember, this is MIS 5b, the post-Eemian slide toward glacial conditions. It kept predators at a distance. Big cats, hyenas, the things with better night vision than you. Fire drew a line they mostly wouldn't cross. And it cooked your food, which meant more calories per mouthful, fewer parasites per meal, and a gut that could spend less energy digesting and more energy healing. But fire alone doesn't explain 70-year lifespans. People do. Nobody survived 90,000 BC alone. The fire someone else kept burning through the night. The food someone else shared when your hunt came up empty. The wound someone else cleaned when you couldn't reach it yourself. Survival had a WE in it. This was a world of bands. Small, mobile groups, probably 20 to 40 people who moved with the seasons and depended on each other for everything. The food sharing wasn't charity. It was insurance. You fed someone today because tomorrow your spear might miss, and you'd need them to feed you. And this cooperative buffering extended to the injured and the old. The healed fractures in the fossil record aren't just medical curiosities. They're proof of care. Proof that someone was fed when they couldn't hunt. Proof that someone was carried when they couldn't walk. Proof that survival was a group project. And the group chose to invest in its members even when it was costly. That's how you got to 70. Not by being tougher than the world, by being held up by the people around you. But before we go any further, let's be honest, because this video would be irresponsible if it wasn't. Here's what we don't know, and it's more than you'd think. Almost every hard number in this video, the mortality rates, the lifespans, the disease loads, is inferred, not measured. We don't have a census from 92,000 years ago. We don't have medical records. We have two things: a thin, biased fossil record, and data from modern forager groups who are not living fossils. The Qafzeh, the Kung, the Ake, they're real people living in the modern world, with trade relationships, some access to outside resources, and specific local ecologies. They're the best analog we have, but they're an analog, not a time machine. The infant mortality numbers, the lifespan data, the weaning patterns, all of it is comparative inference, not direct measurement. Researchers like Trinkhaus have flagged preservation biases, age estimation errors, and mobility effects that make the fossil record unreliable for precise demographic claims. And the variation between groups was enormous. Hunter-gatherer is not one experience. Some forager populations, like the Hiwi, show high adult mortality driven by violence and accidents. A profile some researchers argue might model the Paleolithic better than the more peaceful groups we usually cite. There was no single caveman experience. There were thousands of different lives, in thousands of different ecologies, and we're squinting at them through a keyhole. Even the childbirth story has contested mechanics. The risk is real. No one disputes that human birth is dangerous. But the classic bipedalism narrowed the pelvis while brains got bigger explanation, the obstetrical dilemma, has been challenged. Researchers like Dunsworth argue the tight fit has more to do with metabolic limits on pregnancy than with walking upright. The outcome is the same: birth is dangerous, but the why is still being argued. And then there's the fact that sits in the middle of everything, refusing to let you simplify. That Saint-Césaire skull, a Neanderthal, a deliberate blow to the head. Interpersonal violence, clear as anything. And then, months of healing. The same species, the same community, probably. Someone hit this person hard enough to crack their skull, and then someone, maybe the same someone, maybe not, kept them alive afterward. Brutality and tenderness. In one bone, in one life. That's what the evidence actually looks like. Not a clean story, not paradise lost, and not caveman hell. Something more complicated, more human, and harder to fit on a thumbnail. But there's one more thing the evidence says, and this one might be the strangest of all. Here's where the timeline flips on you. Everything you've heard so far is about 92,000 years ago. Foragers, small bands, no medicine, and yes, dangerous births, dead babies, and infections that would be trivial today. But tens of thousands of years after these people lived, something happened that we call progress. Agriculture, farming, settled villages, stored grain, larger populations. The Neolithic Revolution, the thing that's supposed to make everything better. It made a lot of things worse. When researchers compare the skeletons of pre-agricultural foragers with early farming populations, the farmers lose badly. Their teeth were riddled with cavities. Forager teeth carries rates of 0 to 14%. Farmer teeth, up to 48%. Your cavity problem isn't an ancient human problem. It's a farming problem. Agriculture handed your mouth sugar and starch, and the bacteria that cause decay threw a party that hasn't ended. But it wasn't just teeth. Early farmers were shorter. Their bones show more signs of anemia, more infectious disease, more nutritional stress. The crowd diseases that couldn't exist in the Pleistocene, measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, exploded once populations were dense enough and sedentary enough to sustain them. The very progress we celebrate created the conditions for the epidemics that would define the next 10,000 years of human suffering and famine. Foragers, when studied across populations and controlled for habitat, experienced less famine than agriculturalists. Not zero hardship. Lean seasons were real, and some years were thin, but the diversified forager diet, pulling from dozens of plant and animal sources, was more resilient than a farmer's dependence on one or two crops that could fail. We call farming progress. Their teeth, their height, and their full bellies would disagree. The people of 90,000 BC were, in some measurable ways, the healthier humans. The ones who came after them traded that health for something else. Scale, surplus, civilization, and paid for it with their bodies. So what actually sucked about being born in 90,000 BC? Not daily life, not the food, not the teeth. What sucked was the entrance fee, the gauntlet at the beginning, the coin flip of infancy, the doorway of birth, the splinter that could kill. And that brings us back to you, because the body you're sitting in right now was built by every single one of those pressures. Your birth needed help for the same reason theirs did. The same tight pelvic fit, the same big-brained baby trying to navigate a corridor built for walking. You were almost certainly delivered with hands or instruments or surgery that your forager ancestors simply didn't have. That's not modern convenience. That's a 92,000-year-old problem that we finally solved. Your mouth rots for reasons theirs didn't. Every cavity you've ever had is a downstream consequence of a dietary shift that happened thousands of years after these people lived. They ate what they could find. Meat, tubers, wild plants, seeds, and their teeth survived it. You eat what agriculture made possible, and you need a toothbrush and a dentist to cope with it. You survive a cut because of something they never had. An infected wound that would have been a death sentence in 90,000 BC is something you fix with a tube of antibiotics and a bandage. The gap between their world and yours isn't intelligence. It isn't willpower. It's accumulated knowledge. And they didn't have less of it because they were less capable. They had less of it because they were versed. And you crave cooked food, warmth, and company for reasons that are older than language. Fire, shared meals, and the presence of other people aren't preferences. They're the survival software your lineage wrote in a world where being alone meant being dead. 92,000 years ago, in a cave, a child died, about 12 or 13 years old. The skull shows a healed injury, meaning someone had already saved this child's life once before. And when the child finally died, someone, we don't know who, but someone who knew this child, placed red deer antlers against the chest, laid them deliberately, covered the body with ochre, and buried the child in a way that says, as clearly as anything can say without words, this mattered, this person mattered. That was 90,000 years before the pyramids, before writing, before anyone could record a name. Somebody loved that kid. Somebody decided death deserved a ceremony. So, why did it suck to be born in 90,000 BC? It sucked because being born was the most dangerous thing you would ever do. Because roughly half of all children didn't make it. Because childbirth could kill your mother. Because a broken bone or a bad tooth or an infected cut could end a life that, by every other measure, was strong and long and capable. It didn't suck because life was miserable. It didn't suck because people were ignorant or brutal or short-lived. The adults who cleared the filter, who survived infancy, childhood, infection, injury, lived into their 60s and 70s. They had better teeth than you. They had less famine than the farmers who came after them. They buried their dead with ceremony, healed their wounded with patience, and kept each other alive through cooperation that modern humans still carry in their bones. The horror of 90,000 BC was never that life was short. It was that the dying was crammed into the beginning, a wall at the start of the road, and the people on the other side of that wall, the ones who made it, were remarkable. You are the unbroken end of a chain of babies who survived the wall. Every one of your direct ancestors cleared a filter that took nearly half of all children born. You're not descended from the lucky ones. You're descended from the ones who were carried. Through fire, through food, through hands that wouldn't let go. That's you. That's what you come from.